Well, my question for you is, have you ever run out of gas when you were driving? My first car was a real jalopy. I mean, nothing on it really worked. And one of the things that didn't work was the gas gauge. And you want to talk about living on the ragged edge and being anxiety-filled. You never really know how much gas you have when your gas gauge doesn't work. And so running out of gas is inevitable. And it's embarrassing. And when it happens, all you want to do is get some gas, either get to the gas station or get a gas can filled with gas. And I find it a useful way of thinking about as a kind of a metaphor or analogy to life, because there's times in life, I think, when we feel like we've run out of gas. In fact, we even use the expression with each other, I'm kind of running on empty, which usually means I'm overwhelmed, I've got so much going on, and I'm just going through the motions. I'm still going, but I don't have any energy left. And this sort of image comes to mind when I think about one of the great stories or miracles in the Bible, which is the feeding of the 5,000, that occasion when Jesus produced a whole lot of bread and fish for a bunch of people. And the version of the story I want to look at with you this morning is from Mark's Gospel, the 6th chapter. And I want to look at the story and think about the idea of just kind of running out of hope, running out of answers, running out of energy, running out of options, and feeling like in life we've just run out. And what we do when that happens, and what we can do when that happens, where do we go from there? Because that's what happened to the disciples in this story, as I read the story. In chapter 6, we find that Jesus has called the 12 disciples together, and he's given them some instructions about what to do and how to go out and spread the good word about God's love. And they do that, and they do it well. And it says in verse 13 that they drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. So they were doing great work, casting out demons, healing people. And then there's a next part of that chapter, which is a little bit of an aside, which talks about John the Baptist and how he met his fate, his death. He was beheaded by Herod, and that's sort of another story. And then we come back to the disciples at verse 30 and come to the place where they're asked to feed a whole lot of people. And let me read this for you, verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So you get the picture. The disciples have been out there. They've been, doing God's work, and they're kind of tired. They haven't even had a chance to eat. They're hungry. They're worn down. They're running on empty. And Jesus recognizes this and recognizes that they need rest. So he says, let's pull away from all of this work that we're doing here, and let's go to a place where we can get some rest. Verse 32, so they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Isn't that the way? You're run down, you run out of gas, you're tired, you're worn out, you want to get away, you want to do something relaxing. Maybe sit and watch an Eagles game. And then the doorbell rings or the phone rings, or you get a text, and it's something else that you got to do. Just when they thought they were going to get some rest, the crowd beat them to the other side where the boat landed. And Jesus sees the people, and Jesus, of course, is a man of compassion, and they're like sheep without a shepherd, they're lost, and so he feels compelled to minister to them. And the disciples are probably sitting behind him going, oh, great, all right, yeah. Because they're beat, they're tired, they're hungry. They've run out of gas. Well, by this time, it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said. It's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. Dude, it's late. We're tired. We're hungry. Tell them to get lost. Tell them to go away. But Jesus answered, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, well, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. Go and see. When they found out, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Big deal. What's that? Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. 5,000 men, it says. How about women and children? There's a boatload of people. And it's interesting that Mark is careful to point out that they didn't just barely make it and skimp by with enough for each person. They were satisfied, and there were baskets left over. When God blesses abundantly. When God provides, God truly provides. So what's really going on in the story? Well, you have disciples that are a lot like you and me. Sometimes facing a challenge in life, saying, well, what am I going to do? What can I do? I have limited resources, limited options. Well, when I look at this, I see a major difference between the way the disciples looked at the problem and the way Jesus looked at the problem. Because the disciples saw it as a problem. They saw nothing but problems. Jesus saw possibilities. The problems that the disciples saw, they are pointed out in the story. The first thing they say is, it's late. It's late. What can we do? All the Wawas and 7-Elevens are closed. And, you know, you could read into this a little bit like they're throwing Jesus under the bus a little bit here. You know? Like if you're late for lunch today, it's like, well, the preacher went on a little bit, and we got out late today. You know, Jesus, if you hadn't gone on, you know, this whole Sermon on the Mount thing, we might have had a better chance of getting something to eat here. But it's late. Problem number one. Problem number two. They say, we're in a remote place. There's nowhere around to get food. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Remember you wanted to take us away to a remote place to rest? Remember that plan, Jesus? Didn't work out so well. It's late, it's a remote place, and we don't have the cash. They said it would take about a half a year's worth of work, wages, to provide enough food for all these people. There might have been 10,000 people there if there were 5,000 men. So, lots of problems, Jesus. This thing ain't going to work. And Jesus flips it on them when he said, you give them something to eat. And they said, well, there's really no way. We've run out of gas. We've run out of options. We can't do anything. And I suggest to you that the disciples then really made 2 mistakes that hopefully they learned from in the story, and 2 mistakes that maybe you and I make as Christians, as followers of Jesus, as believers, as churchgoers. And the first mistake is that they tried to tell Jesus what to do. Send them home. We have the answer. Get rid of them. Let them go get their own food. And sometimes we think we know better than God. And we try to tell him what should happen and what needs to happen. And if God would just listen to us, it would all work out. Telling Jesus what to do. Now we think about that and we laugh. But that's what they were doing. And that's what you and I do sometimes when we want our way and our will and not God's will. Telling him what to do rather than listening to what Jesus may be saying to us in the face of a problem. Rather than seeking Jesus and his will and his way when we've run out of gas. Saying, what is God trying to show me at this point in my journey when I feel like I don't have any options and I don't have any energy and I don't have any hope? What does God want to say to me? What does God want to teach me? And the second mistake was that they looked around and they saw the problem. All these people, no food, it's late, no money. They saw the problem without the problem solver. They were measuring the problem without Jesus. They looked at it totally in human terms. And so often we say when we've run out of gas, what am I going to do? Well, you and I may not be able to do anything. But the Son of God, Jesus Christ, may be able to do lots if we let him enter into the formula, into the solution to the problem that we're facing. Because so often in life when we've run out of gas, it's then that the real energy source comes into play and can make a difference. And it just takes me right to a verse that I lean on over and over again, 2 John 4:4. Greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. Greater energy source is in you than anywhere else in the world. If you turn to him, if you look to him when you've run out of gas. Because when you don't have any more answers and you don't know where to turn, there is always one who has the answer. And it's Jesus. The answerer. May not be the answer you like, may not be the answer you want, but Jesus has the answer. Albert Einstein was a fascinating man, I think, and as I've read stories about him, I've just become more and more intrigued about him as a person. And one of my favorite Einstein stories was a story that took place fairly early on when he had begun to be recognized as this brilliant man. And the story is told about Einstein traveling from university to university to give lectures about his theory of relativity and some of the other things he was working on. And people didn't really know who Einstein was at that point. They were just learning about that name. And so his notoriety would gain as he would travel to these different schools by invitation to give a lecture. And so he had a driver that always drove him to these universities. And it was the same pattern over and over. The driver would take him to the location, Einstein be in the back seat, and they'd pull up to the university, and there'd be a contingency from the university would come out and open the back door, and, "Oh, Mr. Einstein, we're so glad to have you," and they'd whisk him away into the lecture hall, and Einstein would give this brilliant lecture, and the driver, who didn't have anything else to do, would go in with them and just kind of sit in the back of the room and listen to the lecture, and when they were done, they'd get back in the car, and the driver would take him back. So this happened over and over and over again. And so on one occasion, when they were going to a university for Einstein to speak, they were talking, and the driver says playfully to Einstein, "You know, I've sat through so many of your lectures." It's really the same lecture over and over that he was giving. He said, "You know, I've heard it so many times, I bet I could give it." And Einstein, in a playful mood, said, "Let's do it. Let's switch places before we get there, and you give the lecture." So they did. They actually changed clothes because the driver had the little driver hat, you know. So they switched places. So the driver's sitting in the back seat, Einstein's driving. And they get to this university, and the professors, they all come running out, and they open the back door of the car, and the driver gets out. "Oh, Mr. Einstein, we're so glad to have you." And they whisk him away and take him into the lecture hall. And Einstein, dressed as the driver, goes and sits in the back of the hall. So the driver gets up there to the podium, and he's going through the lecture. He has it memorized, and it comes off beautifully. Everything's going great. Until someone in the room raises their hand, and they say, "I have a question." And so they ask this deep, penetrating question about relativity. And so when he finishes offering the question, the driver thinks on his feet and says, "Well, that's such a simple question. I'm really surprised you'd even ask it. In fact, that question is so simple, even my driver could answer it." Folks, sometimes we don't have the answer. But there is one who is wiser. There is one who is stronger. There is one who provides faithfully. And when you run out of gas, look to Jesus. Look to Jesus when you have no more answers and don't know where to turn and have no hope. And he will provide. God, thank you for being faithful. Thank you for being our rock. Thank you for being the one we can turn to again and again and again. And for anyone here this morning who's run out of gas, I pray that they might have heard your word of encouragement today, that you might lift them up, and that you might whisper the answers that are needed, and that you might provide the strength to move forward. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.